Welcome to Pod Save America. I'm Jon Favreau.
I'm Jon Lovett.
I'm Tommy Vietor.
On today's pod, Joe Biden's American Rescue Plan is on its way to becoming law. We'll talk about all the economic and political implications, as well as what else Democrats might be able to achieve now that Joe Manchin has indicated that he's potentially open to reforming the filibuster.
The intensity with which I now look not just at the coverage of Joe Manchin, but about like the individual sentences where the dependent clauses are. You can't trust the headlines. Not these days. Yeah. Not with this media.
All right, let's get to the news. Early Saturday morning, after more than 24 hours in session, the Senate passed the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan by a single vote, thanks to the support of all 50 Democrats. The bill now goes back to the House, where Democrats are expected to approve the changes made by the Senate. President Biden will sign the bill shortly afterwards. He had this to say at the White House after it passed the Senate.
When I was elected, I said we were going to get the government out of the business of battling on Twitter and back in the business of delivering for the American people, of making a difference in their lives, giving everyone a chance, a fighting chance, of showing the American people that their government can work for them. And passing the American Rescue Plan will do that. And you know, it may sound strange, but a lot of senators and congressmen I want to thank, but I really want to thank the American people for making all this possible.
The most significant piece of legislation to benefit working families in the modern history of this country. That's not one of your neo-lib shill hosts talking. That was a statement from Budget Chairman Bernie Sanders. Guys, why does Bernie think that? And what are some of the highlights for each of you that haven't been talked about as much? Tommy, let's start with you.
The era of big government is back, baby. I mean, this is. Can I say something really big and totally unfounded, which is that This is a fundamental rejection of Reaganism, right, in the treatment of government as the enemy. It's a bit of a rejection of Clintonism, but we won't focus on that. But you know, it took an approach.
Why not? Why not? Let's do it.
I know. I stage whispered, but you know,
I don't like attacking other podcast hosts.
I mean, this is a truly this is a truly progressive bill. It targets money towards the poorest people. I mean, like the most exciting part of this bill might be the fact that the White House believes it will cut child poverty by 45%, as much as 50% among Black families. I mean, many advanced countries, I think 17 is the statistic you always read, subsidize having a child. Canada provides up to $4,800 per child per year. The United States is finally getting in the game on this front, because there's tons of evidence that suggests that falling into poverty, even for a short period of time as a child, causes permanent damage in terms of your educational attainment, your wages, your health. So this could be an enormous piece of an even bigger bill. And I'll pause there because I'm sure Lovett likes some of the same parts I do.
Yeah, I mean, I think I will actually say, I think stepping back, there was a big fight over the minimum wage. It is actually extraordinary that the Democratic caucus was largely united around the dollar amount of $1.9 trillion, and that really didn't move very much. We'll talk about some of the other fights that played out inside of the bill, but that tells you something really positive about just how much the Democratic caucus has shifted. Across the board, Biden, Schumer, Bernie, everybody recognizes the importance of like going big. And giving people like demonstrable of going big and giving people change that they can see, that they can deposit in a bank, that's like bold and simple, and they were worried more about doing too little rather than doing too much. I agree on what Tommy mentioned. I do think that this it is amazing how much politics has shifted even in the past year. The fact that the child benefit extends to people who in the past wouldn't have been able to get it because it was phased out for people as they made less money and didn't qualify for it. It becomes much more like a permanent credit. It becomes much more like a universal benefit, a universal basic income almost for parents with kids. And I think that's going to be hard to walk back. So there's a lot of things like that that I think are the reason Bernie is trying to make people understand that this is more than just that this is COVID relief. That also, I think, lays the groundwork for a much more progressive government.
Yeah, Democrats have been traditionally in love with like tax credits and sort of complicated benefits. The child allowance is literally going to be like a monthly check of up to $300 per child for a lot of low-income families, even low-income families who are out of work. Eric Levitz over at New York Magazine said that this bill would put more than $7,600 into the bank account of the typical family of four when you combine the direct payments with the child allowance and some of the other benefits. $27 billion in rental assistance for those facing eviction. Dramatically lowers health insurance premiums through the Affordable Care Act. Just almost got no attention in the bill. So middle to upper income people can get subsidies for the first time on the ACA, and lower income people have even bigger subsidies than they had before. $39 billion for child care providers that Elizabeth Warren
and John,
has been fighting.
Just one specific on that healthcare point. Anyone who's ever lost their job and tried to file for COBRA knows how much it fucking sucks, right? COBRA lets you buy into plans that but you no longer have your employer footing part of the bill, so it's just prohibitively expensive. This bill covers 100% of COBRA premiums for 2 years. That's just it's a sea change for someone that desperately needs healthcare but lost their job because of this bill. And they say it's going to reduce the number of uninsured by like 1.3 million by next year. So sorry, I just wanted to add that because there's so many great pieces of this bill.
It's enormously beneficial to people around healthcare. $39 billion for childcare providers. It's going to make all student loan forgiveness tax-free, which is a huge deal. It will save the pensions of more than 1 million unionized workers who are about to lose their retirement. It will shore up those pensions for the next 30 years.
I love Republicans trying to push that around as an attack. Oh no!
Yeah. Oh no! You're going to save people's retirements who've been working. Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
It represents the largest public investment in Native communities ever by the government. I mean, this is look. I think there are bills. And we're going to talk about, what we didn't get in the bill, but there are bills where you compromise a lot and say, well, in the end, the good still outweighs the bad, so half a loaf is better than nothing. This is not that kind of bill, in my opinion. I think this time we got most of a loaf that's pretty fucking big. The loaf is huge.
I think you have to say, yes, like, okay, it seems like there were more, but you can say like there were sort of these like three negotiations. One was over the direct payments, one was over the extension of unemployment, and one was over the minimum wage. The minimum wage fight was, I think, a defeat. It was a defeat for progressives. It is fully not in the bill. We had hoped that it would be in there. That pushes that fight completely off. But as much as I think that the logic around reducing by 17 million who is eligible for the direct payments, or changing the formula on UI, which actually kind of, we can talk about what the actual implications of that are. Like, let's remember, Republicans we remember how there was a moment where Susan Collins and 9 other Republicans were going to meet with Joe Biden at the White House. They had proposed $600 billion. Biden was at $1.9 billion. There was a genuine debate as to whether or not where we were going to land was someplace in the middle so that he could get Republican votes.
Lovett, a anonymous Biden advisor who clearly knows their boss really well, decided to be a source for Politico not long ago and said, "Oh well, I can't believe these Republicans went to the White House and the White House sort of poo-pooed the meeting and said it wasn't really productive, and that must be Ron Klain's fault. The Joe Biden I know would never do that, and clearly Joe Manchin's going to make the number come down from 1.9 to at least 1.3. Joe Manchin didn't make the final top-line number come down at all. That is an enormous victory.
And also, to anyone who wonders, okay, what was it worth to win those Georgia Senate races? The conservative estimate is about $1.3 trillion, right? Like, that's basically the delta between the bipartisan Republican Senate proposal when they had no leverage, right? They probably could have chopped it down even more if they had a ton of leverage, and what was actually passed. So $1.3 trillion is what you all who fought for these Georgia Senate seats got for the American people. Good job.
And where it would be aimed, by the way, just also where it would be aimed, right? Because CARES Act had $500 billion for corporations.
Right, exactly.
And just to put a finer point on the election, out of nearly 160 million votes that were cast in November, David Perdue, the Republican senator from Georgia, was just 14,000 votes away from avoiding a runoff against Jon Ossoff, which he then lost, which then gave us the Senate. 14,000 votes. That is how close we came to $1.9 trillion being, like Tommy said, either $600 billion or maybe nothing. We could have had
600
nothing
is
if
the
Mitch
generous
McConnell.
version.
That's the generous. That's the highest it would have been.
I gotta tell you, putting those Dominion machines there was like one of the most forward-thinking. Think about how that was such a good decision.
Lovett, how do you think Biden's rescue plan compares both substantively and politically with the other two most recent rescue plans, Trump's CARES Act back in March of a year ago and Obama's Recovery Act in 2009?
Let's do the Recovery Act first.
Divide into three parts.
I was about to divide. So we would joke. So just so you know, like we have a joke we now basically, which is like the Recovery Act is divided into three parts because we would say that every time Barack Obama gave a speech about the Recovery Act. So the Recovery Act was $787 billion. This is 1.9. So this is 2.5 times the size. But that was also divided into, as Tommy helpfully pointed out, into three parts, a third of which were tax benefits, a third of which were relief for people who had lost their jobs or were in otherwise in sort of economic trouble. And then another third was long-term investments in infrastructure. So there's two things. One, there's just more money in this bill. It's a much bigger bill. But also that bill was designed, as Jon said, it was based on the theory that you kind of nudge people in various small ways to get them to spend the most overall more efficiently, which very well may be true, but it meant a lot of these benefits were hidden. So like some of the benefits for individuals were through payroll tax credits that they might not see in their paychecks. We have this this $1.9 trillion stimulus gives people an additional $300 a week. This mixed the way in which unemployed and others got direct help, but it was more like $25 a week in direct unemployment insurance, at least in one part of the bill. And even still, this was also a third of the money was for a long-term infrastructure project. So it just gives you a sense that like this is much more money that people will be able to see and know that they're getting and know the origin of it, because I do think that is one of the lessons from the Recovery and Reinvestment Act.
And by the way, we had to pass the Recovery Act through regular order, which means we needed 60 votes for it. People forget that. And why did we do that? Because we couldn't find even 51 Democratic senators who were willing to go through reconciliation back then because everyone was, so enamored with the Senate rules. So for all the frustrations we have now with Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, which are all legitimate, we had a bunch of conservative to moderate Democratic senators back in 2009 who just didn't want to go through the reconciliation route. And we had to and that's why the bill ended up being smaller, And then in terms of the CARES Act, I do think that, even though Trump's CARES Act was like $2.2 trillion, so slightly more money than this, it did deliver most of the benefits or much more of the benefits to businesses than it did to individuals, more to upper income people than it did to lower and middle class income people. So this was a much more progressive piece of legislation than the CARES Act.
It's also good to remember that in 2009, I think Democrats had thought that the Recovery Act would be the first but not the last stimulus bill. And then we ran into Mitch McConnell, who was happy to hurt the country if it hurt Obama politically and benefited him, right? And to their great credit, Biden and Schumer and Pelosi, they did not make that mistake this time. And to your point about the CARES Act, the CARES Act did a lot of good, but right, $500 billion of that bill was in the form of loans and other money to big corporations. And that had to happen. You couldn't have airlines going bankrupt, but it's a lot less targeted. Similarly, the PPP program that went to small businesses created winners and losers in ways that was not great. And so this is direct money to people, it's direct money to states, to schools. I do think the story's not written about how effective it is, right? But in the way the money is used will be uneven. So some states will take the check they get from the federal government and they'll invest it in stuff we think is important. Some red state governors will probably just give rich people a big tax cut. That's just kind of is how it is. But this is a hell of a good start if you want to, get the economy running.
I will say politically too, the fact that every Republican and most Democrats voted for the CARES Act and its $2.2 trillion in spending opened the door, I think, for
sure,
more moderate Democrats to vote for this much money this time around. So I guess thank you, Donald Trump, for that. The fact that we had a Republican president who was not just solely focused on deficits, though I can't remember one who really was once they got to office, because Bush wasn't either. But the fact that the Trump administration, probably because he wasn't paying any fucking attention to legislating, well, actually was, and because he thought that by giving people money he could win re-election, right? Like that's what those are the motives that probably drove him. So not great motives, but I do think it opened the door for Democrats, especially moderate Democrats, to say, yeah, we're not afraid to spend a bunch of money now.
I also do think we benefited from the fact that Republicans spent this week angry at the entity that controls Dr. Seuss's image for the brand maintenance they've decided to do.
It's all culture.
It's a big deal. Like, we're doing like government here. You know, politics is going to ultimately lead to government. We're doing the government part right now while you're doing this Seuss part.
I saw Sawyer Hackett, who worked for Julian Castro during the primary, tweeted just now. Once some prominent Democrat should go out and say that Fred Flintstone is racist, and then we quickly eliminate the filibuster and then see what Fox News covers for the week.
You're joking. Obviously, like, that's a joke, but is it? Yeah. Is it a joke?
It might work. It might work. So, as we mentioned, Biden and Democratic leaders didn't get everything they wanted in the bill. We talked on Thursday about how Senate moderates demanded to lower the upper income threshold for the $1,400 direct payments from $100,000 down to $80,000. Joe Manchin made a last-minute demand to reduce the expanded weekly unemployment benefits from an extra $400 a week to $300 a week, though the first $10,200 worth of benefits will now be tax deductible. And a vote that Bernie Sanders forced on the $15 minimum wage failed when 8 Senate Democrats voted no, including Arizona's Kyrsten Sinema, who drew quite a bit of attention when she marked her vote by flashing a thumbs down on the Senate floor. Tommy, let's start with the unemployment change, which we apparently almost lost Joe Manchin and the entire bill over. What do you think that was all about?
I don't know. I mean, it's hard to know if he really. So the generous explanation is that he really did want to try to target as much of this bill as he could to people under a certain income threshold, right? But like, there also just seems like there's a part of his personality and his governing philosophy where he just draws these lines in the sand and then has to be dragged kicking and screaming back over them. I mean, the final changes he made in terms of unemployment insurance, right? The $400 a week went to $300 a week. That's significant. But that last minute wrangling, like basically what happened was to get him to yes, the benefit is going to expire on September 6th instead of September 31st. And the tax forgiveness part of this will be capped at people who make $150,000 in income, which all said and done wasn't that significant of a change when you look at the scope of the bill.
Yeah, it also, Lovett, to me seemed like, you know, listening to Joe Manchin talk about sort of these last minute wrangling, listening to the other senators who like really tried hard to convince him. I mean, it really did come close to, there was apparently an amendment from Rob Portman that was just going to take the money down from $400 to $300 without making any of it tax deductible and have a shorter time frame. And Manchin was like ready to go with that. And if Manchin did vote for that Portman amendment, it could have sunk the bill in the House. Progressives in the House could have said no. And just by like sitting down, twisting arms, talking, negotiating, compromising, like they got Manchin back, which tells me that like, A, some of the reasons Joe Manchin is against bills or for bills or against provisions or for provisions, like, make little sense. And B, like, he is gettable. Like, if you talk to him and sit down with him, it's, you know, you can actually bring him back. And that's what a lot of the Democratic senators did.
Yeah, I think it is going to continue to be hard to tell when Joe Manchin has a legitimate, moderate policy view based on talking to Democrats and Republicans. And finding finding the center of the Senate, which is quite conservative. Moments when he just actually kind of also believes in a bipartisan process, that he has a kind of aesthetic or kind of faith in bipartisan behavior and wants to model it. Or 3, he knows that he's going to ultimately vote for a lot of massive, very progressive Democratic priorities, as he's done in this case. And he wants to do some performative centrism, some performative moderation. I don't think he hates it when Lindsey Graham and John Thune are on the floor of the Senate joking about like, oh no, they're gonna get my friend Joe Manchin. Somebody protect Joe Manchin from these Democrats. Like, I don't think he hates that at all. Like, in this case, you end up with something where, like, I think for some people it comes out in the wash, but not for people who make over a certain amount who won't get the tax benefit. It seems like he might in part have been genuinely persuaded by people who said, Republicans who told him in person, this is too much of a benefit. It's going to dissuade people from work. We can disagree with him on that, but I think there's always with him going to be a mix of those three incentives.
Tommy, what do you think we do about the minimum wage now? It wasn't just Sinema, but 8 Democratic senators, Manchin, Tester, Angus King of Maine, Jeanne Shaheen and Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire, Tom Carper and Chris Coons of Delaware. They all say they want a minimum wage higher than the current miserable minimum wage of $7.25 an hour that hasn't been raised in over a decade, but didn't make it through this bill. What do we do now?
Yeah, I mean, look, it was very, very disappointing. It is not clear to me if they voted against it because they think $15 is too high, or if it was because the parliamentarian in this instance determined that it couldn't be part of the bill. But it is frustrating. I mean, there's sort of a benchmark piece of legislation out there called the Raise the Wage Act. I think it's Bernie's bill. It has 37 Democrats who co-sponsor it, which is nowhere near enough. So, I mean, I think we're going to either have to make the case, twist some arms, try to get 50 people and find a way to do it in another reconciliation bill, or Republicans and Democrats are going to have to find a compromise that probably is closer to an $11 minimum wage increase. But if they can index that to inflation, that could be an important development in an area that's just been stuck for a decade, and it really needs to be increased.
Love it. What'd you think about that thumbs down from Kyrsten Sinema?
I don't care. I find her logic frustrating. I find the policy decision frustrating. I don't give a shit how she votes. Sometimes they vote with their thumbs down. I don't care. I don't care at all. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you care.
I just think it's like, where do we want to channel our energy, right? Like, I think where we want to channel our energy now is what Tommy was just saying, which is like, okay, if you have Manchin on Meet the Press said every single senator, even Republican senators, wants a higher minimum wage, right? So if you can get a compromise, even with Republicans, to get 11 or something around there that's indexed to inflation, maybe you get 60 votes for that. Or maybe, as Dan has suggested, you fire the parliamentarian quietly so that next time you do a big package like this, you get a more favorable ruling, and then you see what Democrats want for a higher wage. Maybe you get 11, maybe you get 12 from them. The other thing that we can do is the Fairness Project, that has won minimum wage ballot measures in 9 states, red, purple, blue. They want to do more in 2022. Let's get it on the ballot in some states. We can win in very red states there. And then, like, as we look ahead to 2022, we have a bunch of Democratic candidates we're going to nominate for the Senate. Let's make sure they specifically support a $15 minimum wage.
We should focus on the people who voted no and try to understand why they voted no. For example, Shaheen. She said basically she is worried about the tipped minimum wage given the vulnerability of the restaurant industry. Let's make an argument about that. Let's make an argument about why it's really important to raise the tip minimum wage. Sinema had a problem with the process and whether or not to do it through reconciliation. Maybe she's open now to doing a $15 minimum wage otherwise. So, like, each of these people who voted no offered a different motivation. Let's understand those motivations and see which of them are gettable to get that number higher and higher and closer to 50. Because the closer we are to 50, I think the better position we'll be in to negotiate if it ultimately comes down to negotiation over coming down from 15 to 13 to another number, finding other kinds of compromise. Like, for example, when it looked like the $15 minimum wage was going to come out, there was a brief moment where there was an option for figuring out a way to just do a $15 minimum wage for big corporations. That fell away because it seemed complicated and there were questions about how to administer it. But, like, that is a policy idea that's been floating around for a long time. And raising the minimum wage for big corporations would create pressure on the wage across the country. So, like, there are different paths we should pursue. But, like, I would say, like, focusing on the actual motivation for those people and, like, criticize them, put pressure on them, but, like, understand their reasons.
Yeah, like, you don't have to like her. We're stuck with Kyrsten Sinema until 2024. All right, we're stuck with Joe Manchin until then too. We're stuck with them. They're gonna have jobs. There's nothing we can do, and we need their votes. We need every single vote in a Senate that's tied, right, until 2022, and maybe we get some more senators if we're very, very lucky and work very hard. So you're totally right, Lovett, that, like, understanding what has caused these people to oppose it is much better than, like, I see a lot of people tweeting old statements from all these senators who voted no that said they want to raise the minimum wage, as if it's like, gotcha, hypocrite. You know, it's like, well, all of them want to raise the minimum wage. Either they don't think 15 is the right amount, which I disagree with. I want 15. We all want 15. Or they didn't like the process, right? So, like, understand why they didn't like it. Get everyone in a room and let's, like, figure out a way to do this.
Some of this is
the best bet.
Right, like Tester Mansion, like they have a lower cost of living in their states, so there's like a challenge there, and like low cost of living versus high cost of living states. Obviously, one thing that'll help is Dan Pfeiffer's primary challenge to Tom Carper is going to create some pressure on him. To
Dan
move
for
on this issue.
Delaware.
Yeah, and Delaware for Dan, frankly.
Let's talk about the Republicans who gave a grand total of 0 votes for a piece of legislation supported by 70% of Americans and about half of all Republican voters. At the beginning of this process, a lot of political reporters were obsessed with Biden getting Republican votes for this, partly because Republicans spun it that way, partly because Biden said during the campaign that he could get Republicans to work with him. Want to talk about bipartisanship in a second, but what happened to the working class populist party of Josh Hawley and Tom Cotton, guys? What where's that? We didn't get a vote from our populist heroes on the Republican Party. What happened, Tom?
They are full of shit. I mean, Tom Cotton and Mitt Romney, back to the minimum wage, they have a bill that would raise the minimum wage to $10 an hour, but it takes longer. It's by 2025, but it also ties it to an immigration reform measure to screen out undocumented workers. So their bill is not designed to just help the working poor. It's designed to be a wedge issue and probably a popular one. But in a sign of how full of shit Tom Cotton is, Arkansas, his home state, already has a minimum wage above $10 an hour. So this guy's proposing something that doesn't even help his own constituents. So I think that tells you all you need to know about their sincerity in this area.
Lovett, what does the unified Republican opposition to this bill say to you about the future of bipartisanship in the Biden era?
Oh, I'd say prospects are not good. We had talked about this. I think the fact that, I think it's actually obviously, I think Republicans were never going to support en masse this bill. They're just not going to do that. It tells you something about the asymmetric polarization in our country, that Democrats got behind the CARES Act and Republicans will not get behind this. But the fact that none peeled off, no Republicans made the calculation that they should buck their party and get behind this kind of legislation, tells you just how fearful they are of primaries, and how much more afraid they are of primaries in the general election. And it tells you how hard it will be to do the kind of, it just, let me just add it like that. It just tells you how hard it will be to pry Republicans away. Let me just say that faster. It tells you how much more afraid Republicans are of primaries in the general election and how difficult it will be to pry Republicans away from their leaders and from the base to vote with Democrats, even on very, very popular bills like this.
What do you think, Tommy? I mean, my view was, Biden, obviously, part of his campaign was him saying, I can deal with Mitch McConnell. The fever will break. Some of what we heard from Obama back in the day too. But part of it was, I think I can bring the country together around sort of big policy goals. It feels like he achieved the latter here, even if he did not achieve the former.
Yeah, look, people like the bill. The more you tell them about the bill, they like it more, right? I mean, you could make an argument about Washington polarization that the partisanship is actually worse than it was under Obama because the Recovery Act got Republican votes. Now, they're vastly different bills, so that's maybe apples to oranges. But, the thing that I think is hard to understand and confusing about all of this in terms of how it shakes out is that Trump and the Republican Congress are in very different places when it comes to these issues, right? I mean, Trump blames McConnell for the Georgia Senate loss because Democrats ran on giving $2,000 checks and Mitch would only offer $600 checks. So the future of the Republican Party is very much in doubt with this major Trump/McConnell split. And I'm not exactly sure what path they will chart, but it does seem like the Republican members of Congress are wildly out of step with the country and even their own voters.
That's the most important point, I think, for Biden and the Democrats to keep making, right? This whole thing has been the test for Biden to bipartisanship. It's not a test. Biden has done great here. Biden decided to put forth a bill that most Americans, including Republicans, support. He asked Republicans for their input. He met with them. They decided that they didn't really want to play ball. Everyone in the country, or 70% of the country, still supported the bill. It's a bill that will deliver benefits to people in blue states and red states. He had a bunch of mayors and governors who were Republicans supporting it too. If a bunch of Republicans in D.C. want to be, intransigent and just continue to oppose every single thing he does, that's their problem. They're the ones out of step with the voters.
Obviously, there's a lot of different ways you can describe unity. It's an entirely nebulous concept. But one thing that was striking is like after this passed, right? No Republican votes. There was a Times piece that was like, Joe Biden's efforts to produce unity couldn't overcome the acrimony of Washington and the bitter fight over the stimulus bill. I don't think it was that bitter. Like
It wasn't.
It wasn't that bitter.
No.
It was kind of, it is abnormal to have a Republican Party not interested in saving the country in the midst of a pandemic. But the actual process by which it was produced, you got your usual bullshit from your Tom Cotton saying, it's just a check for prisoners, even though they did the exact same thing with the kid. Whatever. There's a lot of the usual shit. But this wasn't a particularly bitter fight. I actually think it was a much less bitter fight than the fight over Obamacare in a lot of respects in terms of how it actually played out. So I don't know. I think what Biden said, right? He's focused on actual policy, not Twitter. I think is having some knock-on effects.
That was, in the inaugural, he said every disagreement doesn't have to be a cause for total war. That's the standard he set. And that's what happened with this bill. There was a bunch of disagreements, but everyone sort of moved on. We passed a huge progressive piece of legislation. Great. Dan had some great ideas in this week's message box, this weekend's message box about how to sell the American Rescue Plan. Tommy, how important do you think it is to take a victory lap on this? And do you have any other good ideas on how to sell this thing?
I think it's important to sell any accomplishment, and this one in particular, because as we talked about earlier in the polling, the more people hear about this bill, the more they will like it. Now, I do think this is a very different sales job than what Obama attempted to do in 2009, right? Because the way Biden is going to sell this bill will be in part to just continue to manage the vaccine rollout well. We haven't even talked about the fact that this bill provides a ton of money from COVID testing and for vaccinations.
Right.
People want the vaccine, or if they don't want the vaccine, they want others around them to be vaccinated so that the cases drop down and they get their lives back, right? People who get checks, they'll probably be happy to get a $1,400 check because they need it. I do worry a bit about the people who got a check the first time during the Trump administration and aren't getting a check this time because the income threshold was changed. But hopefully Biden can hang that change around the Republicans' neck and make them own it. But look, I'm glad that Biden is saying, I want to be out there. I want to talk about this bill. I want to sell it hard. I think that there is definitely room to criticize the ways the Obama White House did or did not sell the stimulus in 2009, but it was also just an entirely different context. Unemployment was way higher. The economy wasn't recovering fast. Hopefully the Biden team will be in a place going into the midterms where the COVID outbreak has just been managed completely in the country and the economy is cooking again, because this was a very different recession. It wasn't a big structural challenge with the banks. It was, everybody having to sit in their house because they didn't want to get sick.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't for lack of trying that we didn't really sell the Recovery Act in 2009. Lovett. How many times did we write the Recovery Act is divided into 3 parts? He did a lot of events after the bill was passed. He traveled all over the country and did a ton of events. I think part of the problem is, the substance of the bill, like you said, Tommy. There's and Lovett, you pointed this out too, that there's tax changes that people can't really see. I saw, Post had a piece this weekend that said Ed Rendell, I can't believe I'm going to bring Ed Rendell up, but he wanted Obama to send a letter to every American saying what benefits they were going to get. And we said no. I think Ed Rendell was right.
Totally.
Donald Trump wanted to fucking sign the checks, sign the stimulus checks. I at the time, I wasn't one of the people criticizing that. Yeah, sign the fucking checks, Joe Biden.
No, I
Put
just
your
didn't want him
face
to
on
sign.
them.
I didn't want Trump to sign them. I didn't want his name on those fucking checks.
Right. It's valuable to do that.
Yes. Look, there was no vaccine for the predatory lending and mortgage crisis that was unfolding. And so there was no clear end in sight. And so we
That's
were
true.
very careful. President Obama was very careful. We were very careful as speechwriters to make sure that even as we talked about all the things the Recovery Act did, we were very nervous about sounding too Pollyanna-ish about the state of the economy because of how hard things were and how long they were going to be hard. So I do think that part of it is just it's a different sort of crisis.
Yeah, Jen said at the briefing this morning that vast majority of Americans will be getting some relief by the end of this month too. That's a huge difference in both the Recovery Act and the Affordable Care Act, which like the benefits for that didn't kick in until 2 years, right? Yeah. And so the fact that a bunch of Americans are going to, they'll know that this bill passed and then a month later are going to get relief. I mean, Biden's got an address, a primetime address that's Thursday now, scheduled to talk about COVID. He's, we think, has the address to Congress, his joint session to Congress, which is like a State of the Union in the first year. He'll hopefully have that to sell it. I saw a story that they're going to be working with like social media influencers to sort of get the word out to different communities that they're doing this. So I think it's going to be a full court press. And, and what Pfeiffer pointed out in his in the message box too is like it's up to all of us too. It like everyone who worked so hard to organize in this election, to like get friends to vote, that work continues in selling what Joe Biden actually did for people. Because if people don't know that the government did anything for them, like you can't blame them for not voting again, right? You gotta be explicit.
Just to paraphrase Mike Tyson for a second, like everyone's got a rollout plan until you get punched in the face. I mean, some shit is going to happen that is going to entirely change the focus of the national conversation. Maybe it'll be another Dr. Seuss related crisis, or maybe it'll be something far more serious. We don't know. I hope that they're able to really focus on this bill and sell it to the American people. But like, you don't always have the choice. No, Fox News certainly isn't going to help you. They don't give a shit what you say.
Well, Fox News are not going to like. Are we going to spend every episode of Pod Save America being like, now for our 2-minute segment on the American Rescue Plan? Like, it's just impossible. It's impossible to do that. Like, some of this is going to be, there's some outside organizations that are going to do some paid advertising. I think that's pretty wise.
That has to be how it's done.
Yeah, I think that's part of it too.
I think we should just need to get. We have to get Meghan Markle to say that Prince Philip fucking hated it.
Good idea. See, now you're thinking outside the box.
Get Oprah
there. I also do think too, like one of the challenges too is like I think Biden also should talk about keeping up the fight for the minimum wage, because I do think that like people were disappointed, and the fight over the minimum wage I think could for a lot of people until if they don't know more about what's in this, like it could that defeat could overshadow the enormity of what they achieved. And so I think like people like Elizabeth Warren, I thought struck the perfect note when she was describing this, like how big of a victory this is. But on these key issues, like the fight continues, and I think Biden should say that too. And I think I'm sure he will.
Yeah, and even in like very online communities, people were wallowing in the defeats and then slowly figuring out what was in the bill. And you'd see Twitter from like policy reporters being like, "Wow, the more I dig into this, the more impactful and big it is." It's like, yeah, no shit. Like let's take a win.
Policy reporters and activists who've been working on these issues for years, like the people, Rosa DeLauro and a lot of the organizers and activists who've been fighting for a child allowance, and Cory Booker and Michael Bennett and Sherrod Brown, they've been pushing this for years, and they could not get people to really pay attention to trying to fight child poverty with a child allowance. And like you talk to any of those people who've been fighting for this for a long time, they're pretty fucking excited right now.
Yeah, I'm thrilled.
Let's talk about what's next for Biden and the Democrats in terms of their legislative agenda. They have one more 51-vote reconciliation process they can use to spend money on infrastructure, climate, and other economic budgetary priorities like we saw in the American Rescue Plan. As long as the filibuster remains in place, everything else has to be passed through the regular 60-vote process. Probably a path to citizenship, protections for dreamers, police reform, the Equality Act, and H.R. 1, which is the voting rights and democracy reform legislation known as the For the People Act. Prime Minister Manchin did a round of interviews this weekend where he made some newsworthy comments on both reconciliation and the filibuster. Here's what he told Mike Allen of Axios.
Reconciliation is not a team sport, and it's not a healthy situation, and it's something we should not repeat.
After you swallow the COVID relief plan, President Biden is going to have a second package. You're laughing, but a second package, maybe even bigger, probably focused on infrastructure and energy, climate.
Those are all good. That's all good. But I'm not going to do it through reconciliation. If my Democrats have bought on, my fellow Democrats have bought on that you have no Republican friends that will work in a reasonable manner, I don't subscribe to that.
Would you support any kind of filibuster reform?
The only thing I have even considered or thought of is basically some through the history, how it used to be.
Making them talk.
There should be pain to a filibuster. There should be pain.
And what is the pain?
The talking, basically. You
got to read the phone book or whatever.
That's it. Do whatever, but make sure you have a little bit of pain. Just don't say, well, no, I'm not going to vote. I'm not going to vote for that. And
what other pain?
Well, you have the pain basically is the filibuster, talking filibuster. They've talked before. Some of the rules could be changed a little bit, but not to the point where just a simple majority rules.
Lovett, he wants to make the filibuster more painful. What does that look like in practice, and why is that potentially big news?
Well, so one thing to know, that I think a lot of people didn't fully understand just how codified and routinized the filibuster is right now, which is nobody has to show up, nobody has to stand up and talk. One staffer in a Senate office just has to respond to an email saying that they are not going to go along with the unanimous consent, right? So it's just like an email response right now that causes this explosion in the number of filibusters. We used to talk about them as they're sort of like shadow filibusters because no one ever actually shows up and does the filibuster. It's predicated on the assumption that there will be a filibuster. And what Manchin is saying here is let's actually force them to have the filibuster. Let's have them show up. Norm Ornstein has written in The Atlantic a number of different ways that this can play out. Some of it is just saying you have to show up and talk. Some of it is changing from you need 60 people to say yes, as opposed to you need 40 people to say no. So if they want to have an ongoing filibuster, 40 people have to literally be in the body. But all this is about getting rid of the assumption that every single piece of legislation requires 60 votes. So basically Manchin is saying he is open to those kinds of reforms. And it's interesting, right? Because people have been shouting questions at Joe Manchin about the filibuster for months now. He seems to be quite frustrated with it. And he's saying, will you abolish the filibuster? Will you abolish the filibuster? And he's always like, no, never. How dare you? Stop asking. I won't even consider it. But as we've said many times, follow along with Pod Save America, that left the room open for some kind of reforms that maybe leaves some version of the filibuster in place, but gets what he wants, which is bipartisan debate, bipartisan involvement, minority involvement in the decisions of the legislature without giving Mitch McConnell a veto on every single bill in perpetuity.
Yeah, I think, Tommy, when I first heard about this, I was like, well, couldn't you see a grandstander like asshole like Ted Cruz or Josh Hawley being like, yeah, I'll sit and talk on the floor for a couple days. But if they have to talk forever, right? Or if they need 40 people, 40 Republican senators basically to maintain a filibuster and to be on the floor constantly, that's pretty. How long can you keep that up? Like maybe that is, and then it sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah, I have more questions than answers about how this process would work. I mean, could you just like stack one filibuster speech after another so that it de facto lasts forever? I don't know that these geezers could pull that off, but it's a question I have. Does Manchin think we need a bunch of Republican votes on a filibuster reform package before he'll support it? I don't know. I know that Manchin backed a version of a filibuster reform bill like this back in 2011 that didn't pass. I mean, look, the talking filibuster is better. We should note that the context, it was used extensively to filibuster civil rights legislation. So there's a dark history there that may get repeated with HR 1. So it's not a great option, but it's a hell of a lot better than just, things as they are now, where basically we could do two bills in Joe Biden's first term and they both will be reconciliation.
Yeah, I think what the talking filibuster does is when the public comes to see the Senate just be at a standstill and just speeches against voting rights and civil rights for like a week at a time, 2 weeks at a time, and it just keeps going and going and going. Eventually, is there more pressure than there would be with the automatic 60 vote margin to at least sit down and start compromising, right? And so maybe on HR 1, you get like, Manchin's sick of this filibuster that's going forever, cinema is, and you say, okay, maybe the Republicans don't want publicly funded elections, but maybe they'll do automatic voter. You know what I'm saying? Like, it at least gives us the possibility for more compromise than we had with, as Lovett was pointing out, just an email that says, yeah, my senators are no, and we're going to have to get 60 no matter what. It's something, and we just had nothing. So it's good news for that.
I also would say, too, like, even on this question about him requiring bipartisan votes on things like infrastructure, these maximal hypotheticals posed to Joe Manchin, he is hell-bent on demonstrating that when he says he's bipartisan, he means it. But he still leaves the door open, and I think sometimes that is lost. Like, so he said, I am not going to get on a bill that cuts them out completely before we start trying.
Trying, yes.
Before we start trying.
I caught that too.
So like he is, I think that one of the reasons sometimes Manchin's positions on some of these things have been presented as like fait accompli or like kind of immovable is because I think he actually wants them to seem that way. He wants them to, when someone that's like, will you ever do this without being bipartisan? He's like, hell no. How dare you even ask me? But when he actually comes down to the governing and the legislating, he is leaving the door open. And look, I'm not saying Joe Manchin is where we want him to be on a whole host of policies, across the board, but I think we just need to be like really specific about where what he's actually been saying, because sometimes Joe Manchin being anti something kind of slows everything down. Like, well, why bother? We don't have Manchin. But like, he's gettable. We should think of him always as being gettable.
Which shows back to our question about, the future of bipartisanship. Even though there were no Republican votes this time, Joe Biden is going to continue the dance of, I want to try to get Republicans to work with me, if not for the American people or because he believes it to be true, for Joe Manchin, for the audience of Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema.
As he should.
As
No
he
cost.
should. As he should. And, today Psaki was asked about Biden's position on the filibuster, and she said again, he would prefer the rules not to be changed. I wish, his position now was Joe Manchin's idea of the talking filibuster is interesting, but like maybe Joe Biden doesn't want to get out in front of the parade. Maybe he wants to have Manchin and the Senate go through this themselves. That's fine. I do think there's going to be a moment where Joe Biden is going to have to show leadership on this and push, particularly on HR1. Maybe the moment is not here yet, but he's going to have to get there at some point.
But there's also like one thing that has been very useful about Joe Biden's moderate aesthetic, which is a lot of times what it really boils down to. We were incredibly frustrated by him in the primary saying that Republicans are going to have an epiphany and all that. One of the advantages of that is when he does come to a progressive position, it looks more moderate. It becomes the kind of consensus position, and that's really valuable. So ultimately, when he does come out for some kind of filibuster reform, you know that it will be a consensus position that some other Democrats that are reluctant can hopefully get behind.
I do think this next reconciliation bill, if it ends up being a reconciliation bill, is going to be pretty wild. It's going to be an infrastructure, climate bill, maybe up to they floated $4 trillion, and now Joe Manchin saying he want it paid for by raising taxes. He wants some pay-fors too, which I'm like, okay, you're going to pass a $4 trillion bill raising taxes, and you're going to do it by getting 10 Republican senators on board? It's like,
Well, that's why he's
I don't know
annoying,
what Joe
right?
Manchin's smoking.
That's why he's annoying, right? Because he wants a $2 to $4 trillion bill, but he won't vote for it if Republicans aren't included. But he says it has to be fully paid for, but he wants to increase the corporate tax rate and then repeal the Trump tax cuts. Like, you know that scenario does not exist. So to float it like that in an interview, to create a dynamic that is impossible to achieve, it's baffling to me. I mean, again, yeah, it'll be like, look, maybe he just likes to make a scene so that he can prove to folks back home that he's, not loved by either party, but get things done and is his own man. It's like, I'm sure that plays well, but it's very fucking frustrating for those of us who are trying to parse his statements and create something that is logically coherent, because it does not exist there.
How dare you, Tommy?
Well,
How fucking dare you talk about Joe Manchin, who we love?
He's our prime minister. Look, I think the most generous interpretation of that is that Joe Manchin was speaking to Republican senators directly, and this is basically saying, this is our opening offer: $4 trillion, bunch of shit. We want to raise taxes to pay for it. We want to work with you guys. What do you got, right? And then we'll see. And then they won't come back and say absolutely not. Some of them will, most of them will, but like his buddies, who are Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski and Mitt Romney, will come back and say, okay, I could do some pay-fors, some taxes. I could cut it down to $3 trillion or $2 trillion. So maybe this is just sort of the opening negotiation here. But I do think, for our purposes, like Democrats and activists and organizers need to start pushing our priorities for this next reconciliation bill, for the Build Back Better bill, whatever it's going to be called. And it can be anything from, I think it's going to be, climate's going to be huge in this bill. This is where we're going to get climate done, to the extent we're going to get done. There's a lot more. There's making the child care allowance permanent could happen in this bill as well. Some of these measures, most of the measures in the COVID relief bill, the American Rescue Plan, only last a year. So making them permanent in the next bill is going to be really important too. So there's a lot we should fight to get done there. I do think on HR1, the key now is going to be really put pressure on your representatives, whether they're Democrat or Republican, in the House and the Senate, especially in the Senate, since it's going to go there now, to pass this bill, to make sure we have a big fight over this. You can go to votesaveamerica.com/forthepeople to learn more about HR1 and to help make sure it gets passed. This is going to be hopefully the next big fight and the real test of Joe Manchin's flirtation with filibuster reform. It's an open flirtation.
It's getting pretty. It's getting pretty flirtatious. Pretty. I think they may.
What are you gonna say?
I don't know. I'm not funny anymore. Maybe I never was. Gotta get out of this pandemic.
It's International Women's Day, and we wanted to give a shout out to our Hysteria friends and co-hosts, Aaron and Alyssa. This week they'll be interviewing Teen Vogue labor writer Kim Kelly about Amazon unionization. And friend of the pod, nominee for USAID, Samantha Power is on Hysteria, so check it out. New episodes are out every Thursday. You can subscribe and listen wherever you get your podcasts.